Hello there, welcome back to the channel. It's Nerdle Empire, and hopefully what's going to just be a short analysis and quick breakdown and more of a question once again. Who would win? The Confederacy of Earth or the Terran Empire? Now I considered doing this as a three-way with the Federation involved as well, but I think that's a bigger video than the scope of this particular series. So, quick analysis here, because this is mostly going to be a question. The Confederacy, we don't know enough about it to do a fair comparison against the much more well-known Terran Empire. But both are similar and have similar goals, and seemingly a similar outlook on the universe. But that's only superficial. There are actually significant differences. For a start, the Terran Empire is run by an autocratic regime headed by an emperor, some kind of senate and high council modelled on that of ancient Rome. Whereas the Confederacy is ruled by a president, which is interesting because a president usually is democratically elected, although North Korea would have something to say about that. It's not clear how President Hansen became president. Is it an autocratic regime? Is it some kind of meritocracy? Is it an autocracy? What is it? My guess would be somewhere in the middle, because they are probably electing a representative in some way. But whether or not it is what I would consider a fair and open election is probably not true. We can say that because a woman is in charge, it's not going to be a sexist, oppressive regime where women can't achieve anything. So clearly humanity still managed to drag itself out of that quagmire by the 25th century. Whether it took the Confederacy a little longer, not sure, but they certainly had done. So there wasn't an element of a big boys club sitting at the top going, yeah, we're in charge of everything. So it wasn't that. Same with the Terran Empire. But the Confederacy seemed to have a representative government in some way, whereas the Terran Empire was a dictatorship. This has multiple different effects on how their navies operate. The Confederacy seemed to operate with a cooperative leadership. Basically, the president oversaw and interacted with the military leaders, but allowed the military leaders to operate large campaigns in the field and simply report back to the president, who, with the Council of Joint Chiefs or whatever, made decisions which they then implemented. In an autocracy, the emperor would often directly lead battles, as we saw with Empress Georgiou. She had her own flagship, she was out in the field leading from the front, and individual captains had perhaps more leeway to do as they pleased, with the empire basically encouraging individuality and brutality from its commanding officers to impose imperial rule across a wider area. This had the downsides of sometimes their own navies, similar to the Klingon navy, developing little factions where little groups of ships and under different admirals would have different fleets and powers and sometimes go at each other. It was the same thing in ancient Rome, with different legions often rivaling with one another under their different respective commanders. But the heads of those legions, and I can assume it would have been similar in the Terran Empire, each head or the admirals would have made up an admiralty, which would have made up part of the Senate, which is what have been ruling over the Terran Empire under the Emperor. If the model is similar to ancient Rome, that's more or less how it would have been, with a legate, for lack of a better, for use the ancient Roman term, being a part of the Senate, but also being the head of a larger army or legion. The Terran Empire seemed to operate under those basic principles, whereas the Confederacy operated on what we would consider a more modern naval doctrine, with generals and a more traditional command structure answerable to a politically elected, in some way, regime. However, their outward aggressive tendencies are similar. The Terrans are a little more, I can't believe I'm going to say this about the Terrans, inclusive with non-humans, although they are considered second-class citizens and different species are treated in different ways. Saru's people, for example, are food, whereas Andorians are not equals, but they are able to serve on Terran vessels and they are able to retain a navy of their own to some degree. All of these races are considered inferior to Terrans, but they are given special privileges if they behave themselves and work within the system of the empire that is imposed upon them. The Confederacy is an extremely racist and xenophobic society, probably, in Star Trek terms, probably more akin to the Breen or the Tholians, and their tolerance for non-human species is absolute zero. Non-humans are nothing to them but either a threat or a slave. A safe universe is a human universe. It's resulting in the same thing, a human-centric dominant military empire, but is achieved through different means. The Terran Empire could take a political route, it would sometimes negotiate, although it wasn't trustworthy. It could live in somewhat peace with its neighbours. There's no particular evidence the Terrans ever managed to conquer the Romulans, for example. Whereas the Confederacy had destroyed these people, utterly conquered or obliterated them. As a result, there is two different approaches. The Terrans seek power and conquest, and to maybe a little bit of little man syndrome where they want to prove themselves as the big boy on the block, whereas the Confederacy felt no need to prove itself to anyone and was quite happy for all these other races to be exterminated. It could be more complicated than that, as again, going back to the Vulcans, as I mentioned in the previous video, if that Vulcan war was a revolt, which seems more likely, clearly the Vulcans maintained a navy, a scientific industry, and other things. As I've said before, if you want your slaves to be useful to you, you can't suppress intelligence. There'd have to be some amongst them who would be usable. But the Confederacy seemed to be much more willing to deem a species broadly unusable and just exterminate them. So, in a conflict, who would win between these two powers? And I'm going to leave that up to you. Bear in mind the way these two powers fight. Terrans fight united when they have a united enemy to fight against. The Confederacy is united by their political ideology and seemingly brutal but unified concept of cultural supremacy. Whereas the Terrans are a little more prone to infighting, which is something that could potentially be exploited. But whenever faced with an external threat, the Terrans are extremely focused and unified against that enemy. And although the Terrans are willing to compromise, like the Confederacy, they are willing to sacrifice massive numbers of their own people, and unlike the Confederacy, they also have a huge surplus of cannon fodder fighters in the form of the Vulcans, the Klingons, the Andorians, and perhaps others to fight against them. Now, there is an element here where we have to remember the Terran Empire officially fell in the late 23rd century, and by the early 25th century the Confederacy still existed. So forget technology, just assume the Terran Empire still exists in the early 25th century, or perhaps the Confederacy of the 24th century, of the late 23rd century rather, still was the one going up against them. And discuss who do you think would come out on top in such a conflict, all things being equal. No third party involvement, nothing like that. And we might do an exploratory video on an exact breakdown of how a battle and war of this nature would take place. But those are the players, that's how they think, that's their basic approach to war. Both are totalitarian regimes, both are not afraid to sacrifice huge numbers of their own people and materials to achieve victory. But which one is willing to take the most punishment?
I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others, and also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.